Well, think we should get started? Think it's time? Well, okay, well, it is 2 o'clock, so. Anyway, thank you guys for coming. I'm glad to see you here today. Next week is our 2 Peaks, 1 book discussion. So if you read the book, A Man Called Ove, or you saw the movie, or you didn't, but you'd like to talk about it anyway, please feel free to come, and we're going to talk about it. And we enjoyed the movie and the book, and anyway, please come if you get a chance next Thursday at 2. And today we're very happy to welcome back David Steffan, who was lucky enough to go on another big archaeological excavation project with the University of Tel Aviv and experts from all over the world. And it was in the Timna Valley, but he's going to tell us all about all the exciting details. But anyway, I hope you will welcome David, and we're really happy that he took the time to share this exciting project that he got to be a part of.
Great.
So, thank you.
Okay. So thank you all for being here. The project is called the Central Timna Valley Project, and just to kind of orient you about where it is. So we have the map here, and this is the detail of the very far south of Israel. So it's in the very far south of Israel, and this is one of the 2 little gulfs that come off the Red Sea. So it looks like little bunny ears. One is the Gulf of Suez, which is over here and goes up towards Egypt in the Suez Canal. And so this is the Gulf of Aqaba, or also known as the Gulf of Eilat, depending on whether you're Jordanian or Israeli. So, it's very interesting where we are, because the country is very, very narrow. And when the modern state of Israel was founded, they definitely wanted to have an outlet to the sea, to the Red Sea. Since they had Mediterranean coastal outlet, they also wanted to have access to the Red Sea as well. And interestingly enough, so Eilat and Aqaba are pretty much twin cities. They're just right here at the head of that gulf. Aqaba, interestingly enough, is Jordan's only port city. Otherwise, it's completely landlocked. So it doesn't have hardly any coastline. It has just a couple miles of coastline right here, and then you get down just about to where the bottom of this is, and you're in Saudi Arabia. So as just kind of a orientation to the Timna Valley, it's right here. It's actually a park. It's not quite a national park because the state of Israel doesn't own it, but it's kind of interesting history. It was bought with funds from the Jewish National Fund, which was designed to help the Jews get a lot of the land back after the Holocaust and that sort of thing. And then also private donors that thought it was a very interesting, kind of national heritage and something that needed to be preserved. So the part in green is the actual park itself that is protected. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that, but in this area, it's the country is very, very narrow, and I'll kind of talk a little bit more about the geography as we go along. So I actually will probably talk a little bit about it right now. So to the west, we have these big, interesting cliffs that are probably a good 1,000 to 1,200 feet high. So it's very, very close to impassable. On the bottom here, we have sandstone layers, and actually that's where the copper is in this really white colored sandstone. Up above, you have limestone layers from what was called the Tethys Ocean, which was an inland ancient sea, and we actually find a lot of fossils that come down from that into the lower area. To the middle of the park, so the park is actually kind of a big crescent. Actually, this would be, yes. To the east of the park, you have the Edomite Mountains. And so these rugged, just almost vertical, very sharp peaks are actually over in Jordan. And so Jordan is just a couple of miles to the east. Israel, or Egypt, is just a couple miles to the west above those big cliffs that I showed you. And then right in the middle, we have Mount Timna itself, which is a volcano. So we have some very interesting geology going on. We've got sedimentary, big bluffs to the west. We've got a volcano in the middle, and then we have uplift mountains on the east. So
How big is the park, David?
the park is
Please.
probably about 3 miles in diameter. It's roughly circular, but there's areas that are outside the park that are still, they're just, it's pretty much open land, not necessarily protected, but not necessarily owned by anyone either. And so we did go out of the park to some extent. So what is the Central Timna Valley Project? So it is a multi-year, multidisciplinary international project. It is sponsored by Tel Aviv University. Tel Aviv University is probably the preeminent archaeology university in the world, just because they have so much there. And they also have a great international program, so a lot of students come to do projects there. And literally in Israel, you can stumble over archaeological items just walking around. You literally can stumble over them, especially in the north around the older cities, especially Jerusalem, Hebron, a lot of what they call the Tell sites, which are along the coastal avenues of approach. And a Tell, so if you ever wondered what Tel Aviv means, Tel Aviv is a spring and Tell is a hill. So when you talk about a Tell site as an archaeological site, it's a man-made hill, and it is a site of just multiple layers of habitation going back many, many years. A lot of times there'll be destruction layers, either from wars where a rival nation came in and knocked the city down, or earthquakes, because the area is very prone to earthquake, as we've seen very recently. So a Tell site is really a lot different than the way Timna is, because Timna, again, to go back kind of to the map, there are a lot of different sites all around the valley. Over on this side, where the big steep cliffs are, and that's where the copper mines are. They brought a lot of the ore down to the central area, to kind of the flanks of Mount Timna, to do the processing. And then there were also 2 oasis towns, one down here called Beora, and then one up here called Yokvatah. Again, when I start kind of talking about some of the ongoing mysteries, is how they got water. So the valley is extremely dry. It's what we call the Arava Desert. So it's really separate from the Negev Desert, which is more in this area. The Arava is actually part of the African Rift Valley that is being separated, and that's really why we have these rugged mountains over here in Jordan and these bluffs over here, and it's actually going 2 different ways. There's what they call Timna's twin, which is up here. It's called Feinan, and it's in Jordan. At one time, you wonder why all this copper is up here and all this copper is down here. Well, they're actually geologically separating from each other. And so that area of Feinan was another very early place where copper was found and utilized.
So that's only about 6 or 7 miles.
So yeah, so there's the mile scale. So
10,
yeah. So I guess the park is about 5 miles in diameter. But so yeah, things are. It feels a lot bigger because things are so rugged there. You think, oh well, that's just a few miles away, but you have to go up and down and through wadis, there's steep ravines and over cliffs and things like that. So it feels a lot bigger than it really is. So I'll talk more about how it's multidisciplinary. So it's really become very interesting because it's kind of become a laboratory for all different kinds of disciplines of archaeology. And so being international, I've worked with Turkish, Greek, Italian, Polish, Romanian, Croatian, Argentine, Swiss, Austrian, Chinese, British, and of course, Indian, and then also Israeli. So obviously a lot of the specialists there are professors from Tel Aviv University. There's professors from the University of Haifa, and then also the Hebrew University of Jerusalem that also take part. So, of course, again, those schools very, very big in archaeology because they're in the perfect spot, and they've really become leaders in the field. So the dig itself, who founded it? So a very very interesting gentleman named Professor Erez Ben Yosef, and it feels really weird to call him professor because Israelis are like super casual. They're not formal at all, and no matter if you're in academia or the military or whatever, you usually call people by their first names, so we just call him Erez. And coming from academia here, it's like you would never dare to call, not like my history professor, I would never call him James, I'd always be Dr. Stewart. But Erez, a very interesting guy. His area of expertise, as he was coming up as a young archaeologist, was paleomagnetism. And this is a really, really interesting, very cutting edge kind of, mainly a dating technique. And so if you're familiar with the poles, the magnetic poles of the Earth, they actually, over time, they will actually shift. They'll shift position, and eventually they'll actually reverse. And they know that it has reversed several times over the centuries, but the magnetic poles are always a little bit in flux, and the whole magnetic field of the Earth is in flux. But the thing is, if you can isolate a time that you know an exact date that something happened, you can find in metal, if metal was melted at a certain day, and you know what day it was, the particles of the metal would actually line up to the pole. They'd be like little compass needles. They would actually line up to the poles. And so that is it's mind-blowing. And like I said, this is very, very, very cutting-edge stuff. And the guy that is he's our administrator, his name's Yoav Vaknin, and he's, again, really, really just amazing. He basically runs the whole excavation logistically, but then he also has his own research. And what he had cut his teeth on, and this year he published a very famous paper that's just kind of rocked the archaeological world about dating destruction layers of cities to the wars that we hear about in the Bible, wars we hear about in Egyptian records, and correlating those and saying, okay, well, we know, pretty close to when this happened because we can actually date these destruction layers where things burned. And one of his very first projects was a place in Jerusalem near the Temple Mount, called the Gavati parking lot. And they know that this villa, it was a pretty nice, sizable house. They know that in 587 BC, and I think they actually know that it was like August 7th or something, so they know that that's the day the Babylonians came in and sacked Jerusalem, burned it down to the ground. And so that's one of their keystones, one of their points, one of their benchmarks of they can look at the metal and the way it was oriented on that day, and then they can correlate, and they can also establish what these fluctuations of the magnetic field is. So very interesting stuff. Again, it's something that Erez, the whole Timna project, he was just looking to kind of correlate some dates. He came there in 2009. He's an Israeli, but he had done a lot of his higher graduate work at University of California, San Diego. And so he came there with some of his colleagues in 2009 to work on dating correlation with carbon-14. And then, of course, because Timna had smelting remains, being a copper smelting area that went way back, this was something that they could start correlating. And he went to a site that had been initially dated to the 12th and 13th century BC, and belonging to the Egyptians. Like I said, Egypt is right here. The Egyptians had overland routes right here. Also, they had a port on their side, the Gulf of Suez, where they could sail around to this area. And so they did, for a time, utilize the copper fields here. We also know that the Egyptians mined copper in the Sinai Peninsula, and that they also had areas there where they worked. So it had pretty much been established in the 1930s by a guy named Nelson Glick that this site may have been actually in the 10th century BC, not the Egyptian phase, but actually in the 10th century. And so he was the one that first proposed, hey, this might be the site of King Solomon's mines. So interestingly, King Solomon's mines are not mentioned at all in the Bible, but it came from a novel that was written in 1885 by a guy named H. Rider Haggard, and he didn't set it in the Middle East. He actually set it in Africa, and they weren't finding copper, but they were finding gold and diamonds. But the whole thing was the explanation. People were reaching out for an explanation of how Solomon was able to, in just several generations from when David captured Jerusalem from the Jebusites, and they made this move from being nomads to being sedentary, and in just a couple of generations they came to control a whole lot of this area that we call the Levant or Palestine, and they were able to turn this very small city into a regional center. They were able to fortify it, and then the big thing was they were able to build this really fabulous temple. And so people were kind of just reaching out saying, well, where'd they get the money? It's like, well, maybe went to Africa and found diamonds and gold. But in those days, copper and then also bronze, after it was alloyed with tin, that was the big money thing of the day. I mean, that was like if you had copper, you were like oil sheiks. You had power, you had wealth, and so again, that's one of the big questions of Timna, is addressing the question of King Solomon's mines. So when this Glick was there in the 1930s, he found this hill, and the hill was kind of like a fortification, and it was a very steep-sided hill. It had one way in, it had a gate. He called it Slaves Hill, and his idea was that when Solomon was fighting the locals down in this area called the Edomites, and they all figure very, very prominently in the whole story of Timna as well, that captives were made to work in the mines, and so they called it Slaves Hill. And as I go through, we'll see that they may have not really been slaves. They may have been much better treated because they had the ability to smelt copper. And again, this was almost considered like alchemy at the time, because metallurgy was so new, and if you had the ability to smelt copper, it was very interesting. Before we even had coinage as we know it, one of the very earliest forms of currency was copper axes. So it's like they would use that, they would actually create those as a trade currency. So it's like you could take it and spend it, or you could use it as an axe. So that was very, very interesting. And so so the interpretation stood for about 30 years. Then his assistant and photographer named Benno Rothenberg came back to the area that we call the Araba, so this Rift Valley. He did a lot in the Rift Valley. He came in and looked at Timna. He really, with his dating, he looked at the pottery that was found in this area, and he, again, assigned this back to the Egyptians. He said, well, we don't really know anything about the Edomites. I personally call the Edomites an invisible empire, and again, I'll talk more about it. They're very, very mysterious. So Rothenberg worked there for years and years, and he started to actually find the mines themselves. So he was finding mines that were shafts that went into the hard rock, into the actual sandstone, and then they would do galleries, and they would actually extract the copper from the sandstone. And if anybody wants to come up afterwards, I have ore samples so you can kind of see what the actual copper ore looked like. And then they also had what they called plate mines, and what actually they didn't call them plate mines. We as modern people call them plate mines because they're just little dimples in the earth, maybe 4 or 5 feet wide, and that's actually in what they call the placer. So the placer is just gravel and alluvial materials that have fallen off the cliffs, but there's still copper in that. And so they would dig down into these shafts and just loose pieces of ore, and they would fill it back in, or they fill it in from the next one they were digging. And so when you look around, you'll see all these little, they just look like these little, circular, they're like plate shaped. And so Rothenberg called those plate mines. And it's interesting, with people speaking Hebrew, they were getting placer and placer. They started calling them placers, and then they were kind of correlating that with placers and placer and plates, and they're like, okay, no, they're really different things. They're all in the same area, but when you talk about placer mining, you're talking about actually sorting through loose material versus like a hard rock mining where you're actually making shafts into the actual load-bearing or the load of copper ore that's more pure. So Rothenberg discovers this very interesting Egyptian temple in 1969, and also a very interesting inscription of Ramses III, and I'll show you pictures of that as we go through the slides. So again, he goes back to this, dating the whole site 3 centuries before Solomon's kingdom. And so this kind of began the Egyptian paradigm. And so I was like, okay, well, maybe it's not Solomon's mines. Maybe it was the Egyptians. The Egyptians were a powerful empire, and they were the ones that probably would have been able to do this. And they found descriptions of a place called Attica in the Egyptian records about how Ramses III had sent an expedition to go and mine copper in Attica. So we also know that in the 12th century there was kind of this big cataclysmic crash of a lot of the civilizations in the Middle East. They don't know if it was drought, sudden climate change. Very, very likely it was that a lot of the things that people had relied on as far as crops and that sort of thing suddenly weren't growing. This is when the Trojan War happened. It's also when the Hittite Empire kind of just faded from the scene very quickly. And then there was also a lot of problems in the kind of the wider Mediterranean world as this happened. And so the Egyptians kind of pulled back into Egypt. They let parts of their empire go. They kind of went back and regrouped. So back to the modern day. So when Ayres arrived in 2009 and using these modern methods, he dated things on Slaves Hill back to the 10th century. So suddenly we're back to King Solomon's time. And the interpretation being that because of all this copper, that was where Solomon was able to derive this wealth, that he was able to create a real powerful kingdom, also to build the temple, and then also to start making fortified cities in the northern part of Israel. So when Egypt left, there was a power vacuum, and the people of Edom, which were the natives down in this area, these are the Edomite mountains. They may have been employed in the mines. They may have gotten their technology to smelt from the Egyptians, or they may have just been able to figure it out on their own. But for most of the kind of consensus is that they were the ones that were actually conducting the mining. Whether it was trade, just direct trade with Israel, or if it was if they were, for a while they were a vassal state, because Solomon did expand the boundaries of Israel greatly, whether they were a vassal state that was paying tribute, or then another interpretation was that the Israeli kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, was actually letting the Edomites use the Arab Valley as trade. And so they may have been deriving a lot of their wealth and power from trade, but because they were allowed to do this trade, they were supplying copper and other wealth to Israel. So again, things that are very interesting, and hopefully we'll learn more and more about them. So this end of this kind of Egyptian paradigm, and Ayres started organizing. He got a job at Tell Aviv University, where he's still employed. He started bringing his various colleagues in, also international specialists to come in and look at all kinds of different things at the site. And that was really how, in 2012, the actual expedition, the Central Timna Valley Project, was established. And it's pretty much been an ongoing project every winter. We missed a couple of years because of the pandemic, especially as an international. They had a couple of small, like 1-week expeditions with just students from Tel Aviv going down to do some minor surveys and collect a few samples and things like that. But so this is the first dig in about 3 years, the one that happened back in January, early February. So there's so many questions that it's really going to be a very interesting thing to bring in international specialists from all over the place. There's new methods, new techniques, methodologies that, you know, a generation ago were almost unheard of. They were just getting into carbon-14 dating, and when we're talking about things that are 1,000 years old, 4,000 years old, 7,000 years old, carbon-14 dating is very accurate. Around here, you know, if you find something in your yard you know, an old tool, carbon-14 dating might say, well, it could be from 4 days ago, or it could be 800 years old. So around here, because our time scale of history is a lot shorter, it's not so helpful around here. But when you're talking about the amount of time and the scale of time that we're talking about in Timna, carbon-14 can be very useful. Something that they've just come up with in the last, you know, decade really is something called OSL. It's optically stimulated luminescence. It actually looks at quartz crystals, and it can tell when they last saw daylight. And so a lot of times we'd see some of well, Yoav especially, you know, running around with like a little red light, and he'd be collecting these samples in the dark because you couldn't expose them. You'd ruin the sample if you exposed it to modern light. So OSL is something that is being employed, especially in the mines, because the mines, you know, a lot of these haven't seen light for, you know, since they were actually being operated. The use of drones, that's become very big, and also DNA. So there's a number of projects trying to we can tell about the people. There's, you know, been skeletons found. There's DNA left over from the animals that were there. Because this area is so dry, textiles are very well preserved. DNA is very well preserved. A lot of organics are very well preserved too. So, and I'll talk about a very special find that just kind of, you know, rocked the archaeological world that happened back in 2020. It actually kind of happened when everything was a little bit quiet because of the pandemic, but they were able to start going through some of the old textiles and found this and published it. So paleobotany, the gentleman that was my first supervisor when I was there in 2020, the very beginning of 2020, he's been doing something called a fuel study. He's been looking at dendrochronology, and then also looking at, so that's tree ring dating, and then also looking at charcoal. So whenever we'd find charcoal, he'd be very, oh, charcoal, and you had to be very careful with it and not to damage it because it's very brittle. But he could look at it under a microscope and tell what tree variety it was. And so this is a very big question of how they were able to smelt. You know, did they bring charcoal in? Did they make charcoal out of the trees? You know, how did they get their fuel? And his interpretation, and it's proving out, is that it led to the decline because they were using all of the acacia trees, which is the only real tree in the area, other than down around the ocean. There may be more palm trees that were growing down in this area, but the acacia tree, they pretty much used up all their fuel, and so it was getting more and more expensive to try to bring fuel in, and they were using charcoal in the actual smelting process. And charcoal doesn't travel well. So charcoal, if you smelt it, you know, up on the Mediterranean coast where there's lots of trees, but you try to bring it, you know, several hundred kilometers across the desert, it's just going to be powder when you get there. So that was a very interesting study, and it again is kind of ongoing. So a lot of very interesting things going on, and also towards the end talk about some of the very exciting, you know, very interesting mysteries that we're looking at. But we'll just go ahead and go through the slides. So this is starting back on January 20th and running through the first week of last February. So it's one of the very few digs that happen in the winter in Israel, because in the summertime, up north along the Mediterranean coast, here in the Galilee, in this area, it's hot, and it's actually somewhat muggy because of the Mediterranean, but down here it's usually 135, you know, 130 you know, it's just not, you're just not able to work here during the summer. A lot of the people that live here go down to the beach and hang out at the beach, and a lot of the houses there are very, you know, very well built to withstand the heat. But at this time of year, it's perfect working weather, between 60 and 80 degrees in the middle of January, and so that was, you know, very, very appealing. I'll talk a little bit more about how I got involved as we go forward. So when we first arrived, we were sent out, all of us that were volunteers, and again, the volunteers, very international group, we were sent out on a pedestrian survey. And pedestrian survey is exactly what it sounds like. You walk around and you look for things. So, but this was very good training, and this gentleman here in the lead, his name is Ashal Home, and he is a spatial archaeologist. So he's not necessarily so concerned about the little finds and the 1 meter square. He's more interested in the big picture. So it's kind of like the macro archaeology and how things are related and what the avenues of approach are, and just how kind of the big picture and the way things relate together. And it's a great site for him because it's over multiple kilometers. It's not just a single tell being a hill of habitation, a mound of habitation. The thing is, there's a lot fewer artifacts because in a tell you have layers and layers of habitation, and you have all these different artifacts. So you have to really develop a sharp eye as you go out and look around for things. So we went out with him to learn how to spot the things we're looking for. And again, I encourage you at the end to come up here and look at the different things that we learn to identify as we're walking around. Because if there's enough of them in an area, we know that it's an area that probably should be actually intensely excavated. So we started walking around the park. Right along the edges of Mount Timna, there's this very interesting substance. They call it tufion. Is Larry Harris here? A geologist would probably know. Again, it's one of the things I ran into, that either between the Hebrew and the American, some things aren't pronounced the same. Some of them are entirely different. But the tufion is really interesting because it's like this shell, and they don't know if it's like from mineralization or if it was from heat from the volcano that was nearby. But it actually protects the underlying sandstone to some extent. But it's really interesting because it forms this really interesting shell. One of the bad things about it is that when it flakes off, it looks almost exactly like pottery. And so when you're walking around, but you drop that, and if it goes clink, it's glassy and it is pottery. But if it goes thud like that, it's what I call false pottery. So again, we walked around to kind of learn what we needed to identify to recognize a site, and then of course tell the supervisors, we found this here, we probably should look at it. This is really interesting. This is what they call the square man. So this is a petroglyph, kind of hard to see, but he's got his arms up here, and he's kind of more than a stick figure. He's more of a box figure, but there's numerous petroglyphs all around the valley, and it's very interesting too because of such a time span of history. Some of them can be dated because of just the depth, also the style. Also, there's one that is actually on Slaves Hill, and it's of a camel. And we know that camels, originally they were using donkeys in the area, and camels were domesticated and brought into the area at a certain time. So we know that was after camels had been actually introduced to the area. So always interesting to walk around and start to identify these things. So this is probably a 2-room structure, and a lot of times these structures were just maybe a 4-foot foundation, and because it's so dreadfully hot in the summertime, that most likely most of the mining was going on there in the winter. And the Edomites, being a fairly nomadic people, especially at this phase, they were coming in, and they would have these kind of foundational walls, and they put a tent over the top. So it was a little bit better than a tent. You might be there for several months in the winter, and then move on. But so as we're walking around, we started making note of these sorts of things. There were certain areas of the park where, especially Rottenberg, had done a very good job of surveying, and then there was these large blank spots on the map. And so some of us that were selected to continue with the survey that weren't sent to to dig squares got to do a lot more exploring, and I'll explain that too as I go along here. So again, just looking at these different spots. This is an area that they call Solomon's Pillars, and this is a very iconic thing to modern Israelis. Just about anybody would recognize this rock formation because it's just one of the big attractions of the park. It's just kind of, just like everybody would recognize, Mount Hood or Pikes Peak or something like that. This was very interesting because I was talking about the Egyptians, and this area is actually, there was a temple that was dedicated to Hathor, and this is a 12th century, maybe 13th century. But it's very interesting too because this temple was also used by the Midianites at different times because they found that in the various strata of the dig. But way up here, and I'll show you in a minute, there was a petroglyph that was commissioned by Ramses III, and it was dedicated to the goddess Hathor, who was, kind of the patron goddess of miners, and was, supposed to keep them safe and bless their expedition. So again, this area has been, obviously it's now kind of a national heritage site. It's actually walled off and that sort of thing, but a very good education for those that just needed to know what they were looking for. So this is the actual Hathor temple that has been excavated. It has these very interesting little niches up here where there would have been most likely idols. This would have been, again, a tent shrine. So it would have had a permanent wall, but then when it was actually operating, it would have had a tent cover over the top of it. So, again, very interesting. They have, so you can kind of go and see everything from above, and also go see the Ramses III petroglyph. They have these stairs and walkways that go up into the cliffs. So here is the actual petroglyph, and keep in mind that this is 3,200 years old. So and you can actually see the outline of the goddess better. So Ramses III is here, but you can see her waist and her arms right there. But to make things a little easier, here's a very good sketch of it. So, and they can date this very precisely because from Egyptian sources we know exactly when Ramses III ruled in the 12th century BC. Very interesting thing too, we have what they call cartouches, and that comes from the French word meaning a case for cartridges. And this goes back to when Napoleon had invaded Egypt back in the early 1800s, and they saw that certain groups of symbols were in this little pouch, and so they called that a cartouche. And so a cartouche, usually that was something very important, like a personal name. So this collection of symbols, and it was encapsulated in this meant somebody important. And so this meant this is Ramses III, and this is whatever he's. So this is almost like the cartoons with the little voice bubble. So this is my interpretation. So is that this is what he's asking for is up in this little cartouche, and then he's offering Hathor a drink offering, in exchange for blessing the enterprise and the safety of the miners. So here's a shal up on the cliff, pointing it out to us, so we can kind of understand where it is. This is actually at the visitor center, and again, when the park was developed, they moved away and they moved into this kind of Egyptian paradigm. So the whole place was really, really promoted in the 70s and 80s as being Egyptian, and now we're kind of pulling back from that idea, saying, well, this is Egypt's got lots of their own history. This is really more interesting to Israel because we're looking more at the history of the kingdom of Israel and what they did and what they did with trade with the Edomites and that sort of thing. So again, a lot of this is actually getting a little bit passé, and it seems a little corny now because of the reinterpretation of the times. It's like, well, the Egyptians were here, but they're only a very small part of the overall picture of what happened at Timna. This is going up into the cliffs, and so the whole group got to go up there. Very good picture of Solomon's Pillars. Again, like I say, this is a very, iconic image in Israel. It's just, very well known. People that come to Timna, they pretty much always go see the Solomon Pillars. They almost always see the Hathor Temple. There's other things you can do. You can go actually see some of the mines. Some of them actually, again, pretty developed that you can go into, and they encourage it. They actually put stone or steel steps into them, and guardrails and that sort of thing, so people can go into some of the mines. This is a sample that was from Slaves Hill, and this is one of the things that really suggested to people that they weren't slaves. They were actually extremely highly respected, highly paid specialists. Again, I said that at that time, metallurgy was basically like alchemy or magic or something. If you were able to take a rock and you knew how to heat it and how to smelt it into metal, which was just extremely valuable. Like I was saying, copper axes were considered a form of currency. You could pretty much command anything you wanted. And so royal purple was something that was very common among royalty. It was the color of royalty. It is extremely expensive because it takes the multiple little glands from a type of sea snail that's found in the Mediterranean. It takes tons and tons of material from many snails to make this royal purple. So it was pretty much the most luxurious cloth, and it was only the very very wealthy or royalty or extremely high status priests ever wore royal purple. So this being found on Slaves Hill, suddenly it was, well, apparently these people weren't slaves, and then a lot of the archaeozoologists, they were finding foodstuffs like fish bones from the Mediterranean, so they were being imported food. They weren't eating, having to eat the local food. They were actually importing food for these people too. So this, again, like I said, this kind of was popped up during the pandemic. That they actually figured out that this was royal purple, and so this was just a huge find. It had never been found anywhere that far south. Most of it had all been found in the bigger cities, a lot of the coastal cities in Jerusalem, places like that. So that was an incredibly big find, and it really changed a lot of the interpretation about the status of the smelters. Smelters being the people. So this is up on Slaves Hill, and this is actually an experiment that one of the graduate students is doing, where they have different types of cloth and they're exposing it to the elements to see how quickly it degrades. Again, they're trying to get a time scale on it, just to see if it's buried, it lasts longer. If it's exposed, how long is it going to last in the environment. And a few days ago, I got big news. It rained in Timna, and the creeks flowed, and so that happens maybe once a year if you're lucky. So again, really, really dry, and the benefit for the people that study textiles is that it's just super interesting, and really, really interesting to find this royal purple there. But also, this is kind of just an open air laboratory, and this hill is what I mentioned. It was like a fortress, and the interpretation that it was a prison to keep people in. But no, now we're thinking this is where the smelters, the very high status individuals that knew this stuff, you were keeping them safe, and you were keeping the raiders and everybody else out and away from them. So this was more like a fortification. This is a view from Slaves Hill, so you can see very high. So this is Solomon's Pillars over here, and the Hathor Temple, and this is the modern road that goes over to that area. So you can see it's very, very high. There's only one way up, and it actually had a fortified gatehouse. And at the end of the expedition, we actually did a little bit of rehabilitation work on the stairs at the gatehouse, because just during the excavation, a lot of people going up onto the Slaves Hill, it kind of degraded the path and that sort of thing. This is the rock. This is the rock that actually has the camel petroglyph in it. So again, we can date it to a point that was after the domestication of camels and the introduction into the southern Levant area. This is actually remnants of the gatehouse right here as you go up onto Slaves Hill. So the next day, we set out, they kind of identified those of us that had some experience, those of us that could really recognize things. And of course, growing up in this country, I was always looking for arrowheads, always looking for interesting rocks, and so I've got a pretty good eye for that, and then just really good, long vision to recognize patterns and that sort of thing. And this young lady here, she's half Italian, half Israeli, but she was a specialist in, among other things, she knew a lot about flint knapping and could recognize flint that had been worked and cores, so the actual flint rock, and then the places where things had been chipped off. A lot of times they would, if you were waiting for something to happen, you could always make tools out of flint, and flint is naturally occurring in this area. We had a lot more area to cover as a smaller survey team, and so again, we were being sent out to the blank spots on the map. So the places where Rothenberg had never made it to, or even previous expeditions. So we were sent out to kind of investigate things, to look for things for one, and then to also investigate things that may have been just briefly noted, sent back to look at them a little bit more thoroughly. So Yoav, that I mentioned, that was the administrator of the project, he was working on these sites, which were initially interpreted to be burial mounds. So they're called tumuli, or singular is tumulus. So a tumulus is basically a tomb. They are very similar to a lot of cultures where especially high status individuals or possibly a family is buried in a pile of very big rocks. And I mean, in the desert where you've got, you have very little water, to take, and it's a great sign of respect if you're going to take and move all these big rocks and pile them up to protect the remains of those people. So that's definitely a sign of respect. It's very unfortunate that over the centuries, so most of these had been looted in antiquity. A lot of times it was just herders, Bedouin or something like that herding their sheep and goats around, and they're like, oh, I think I'll dig this up. But a lot of times, a lot of the smaller things they missed, and so we found beads. Of course, once we find skeletons, usually an anthropologist from up north would come down, and because of the religious laws in Israel, if you identify, say, okay, well, this is before Jews were here, because Jews have a prohibition against desecrating cemeteries. So especially if you can identify this, say, okay, well, this is from 3000 BC, and the Jews didn't get here until 1200 or so BC, we know that this is something that we can continue on excavating. So this is at the north edge of the park, and so a lot of these had not really been systematically excavated. So that was kind of his task, and so we went out as we were going out onto the survey to look at some of these sites. This is something that, this is what they call the Wadi Timna, and it's a big kind of outwash plain. Like I say, when the one day of the year rain comes, this is maybe several feet deep in water and really wide. It's just flash flood, and then it's over because all that rain falls on a lot of bare rock. So a shell is up here on this hillside, or this little kind of promontory, investigating this, and we found a lot of these. These were kind of like watchtowers, and so most likely they were when other people were working with their heads down, working the ore, or doing whatever kind of handwork they were doing. They'd have somebody out there kind of watching the avenues of approach, just to keep them safe. So this was almost like a little security outpost, and we found a number of these. So pretty interesting. Usually not a lot of material culture there, because it was just kind of a place to sit. And you might find a few flint flakes, because as they're sitting there, they might be doing some flint knapping or something like that. But usually it was not where they prepared food or did anything industrial like smelting. But always interesting to make a note of. And another picture of that. Same area. That I think that was just to kind of give you an idea of what the wadi floor looks like. Again, that once a year, this is just kind of inundated in water, and then it's just super dry all the rest of the time. So our task on this day was to climb Mount Timna. And so Mount Timna is the volcano that's right in the middle of the valley. And Erez had been looking at satellite imagery, and he said, there's a tumulus on the top of Mount Timna. It wasn't actually the very, very tip top. Mount Timna has kind of two flat summits. The main summit actually has the Israeli National Trail, which goes all the way across the country, goes right across the summit. But this kind of western peak of Mount Timna is very rarely visited, and of course, very, very, very hard to access. So this is a picture of it from down here at the Wadi. So we were headed up to this area because Erez had seen in the satellite imagery that there was a very pronounced tumulus, and then he also thought there was a stone quarry there, just from the way it looked from the satellite imagery. So it's like, okay, you guys get to go up there. So I thought it was great because it's like adventure archaeology. My first dig, I was looking at a square meter and moving little pieces of dust with little tiny brushes and scraping with a trowel. So this was like the macro archaeology. So being out on the survey and just this whole spatial archaeology, the relationship of things, and then also just trying to fill in these blank spots on the map. So about half the dig I got to do this, and Ashella kept asking me, he's like, do you want to go dig? It's like, I'm like, no, I love doing this. We'll have the second week we can dig, and the second week he actually got his own dig site to be the supervisor of, but he gave me the great honor of being his assistant to go out and explore, and we had kind of a revolving team, but we were pretty much the two that were the constant on the survey and going out and looking at things. This is really interesting. There's several of these rocks on the park that they call the mushroom rocks. So again, this is a harder layer of sediment, and actually on this one it's probably volcanic that's over sedimentary, that this is like a capstone of volcanic rock, and then this is softer sedimentary rock. And so there's several of these kind of mushroom-shaped rocks. And so again, that's up there is our goal. So we have to get up to that location. Uh-oh.
Let's start that up again. Sorry.
Oh, shoot.
How long were you there?
2 weeks. And I was actually there, the dig itself was 2 weeks, but because it's a 9-hour time difference, I always like to get there a couple days early to kind of adjust. And the first time I was there, I stayed in Tel Aviv, and I didn't really like it. Tel Aviv's just like any other big city. I mean, it's just really loud and crowded and noisy. But this time I stayed in one of the oasis towns. It's a town called Beora, and I'll show you as we go in. So I stayed there, and then I stayed there a couple of days afterwards to kind of recover, but I did a day trip up to Petra afterwards, so I have some pictures of that also. And so that was a great deal of fun, and it's right behind all of those big jagged mountains over, obviously, in Jordan, and you have to go down all the way to Aqaba, and there's one pass that goes through the jagged, Edomite mountains to get to the interior of Jordan. So going again up Mount Timna, took us half the day to get up there. Very, very difficult. But once we got on top, it was just amazing because again, it's like very volcanic, and it was just, it was just very. It was like you could have played baseball there practically. Just very nicely open. I was very surprised to find copper there, but again, this was the volcano happened after a lot of the sedimentary layers were put down. So this may have been, the lava coming up through the sedimentary layers actually kind of cooked some of the copper. And so, again, very, very, very surprised to find it there. But again, that's what the survey is about. It's about going out and locating sites and making note of them. So this is the tumulus. And again, sadly, I would dare say all of these have been looted in antiquity. This one was open. It looked like most likely a desert fox was living in there at this point, but because the survey, again, you have a lot of area to cover, so you don't really get a chance to excavate. But that's again the directors of the dig will say, okay, well, we think that this warrants sending people up here to excavate. And again, this would have been very difficult to excavate to get all the tools and everything you would need to get up there. So it may happen, it may happen in a subsequent season, but it's very interesting that there's a lot of copper ore in here. And it's also very interesting that some of the pre-Bronze Age people were actually mining the copper. I was like, well, why? They didn't know how to make metal, but they were using it for a pigment. So it's got this beautiful green color, and so they were actually mining it. They didn't know really what copper was, but the raw copper just had this beautiful, green color, so that they could use it as a pigment. And then also, being a beautiful rock, we think this is probably a very high status individual to be buried at the top of the mountain with all these big rocks that were collected to make the tumulus. And it's very interesting. Right over here, it looks like a volcanic fault, like from an earthquake or something. And so there's a lot of these really square rocks up here on the top. And we actually found one little area, and here is a guy looking into this little hollow in the rocks that somebody actually cleared this out. Again, they might have had a tent over it. This may have been some place where they could be up on the top of the mountain if there were, enemies around, that sort of thing. But this is the area that Ayers had seen from the satellite imagery, thought that this was a quarry. And we determined that no, this was just natural rock. It was just volcanic rock that had cleaved off into these really nice, very block shapes. And somebody did do something here, but it would have been absolutely impractical to take, even though it was really nice rock, to take it down into the valley to do something with, to build or something. So the tumulus, yes, was built out of this rock, but it was maybe 100 yards away from the actual, it's a natural quarry. So, but very interesting, and that's something that we were sent up there to investigate.
Did they do gem mining at all? Was there any gem?
No. There wasn't any gems there. I think that I may have actually found a piece of marble, and again, I will have to go back and check. But marble is actually limestone that gets cooked, and so it would stand to reason. The conventional wisdom is there's no marble in Israel. And I had an Israeli say, nope, it can't be marble, there's no marble in Israel. It's like, well, maybe there's a little bit. There wasn't ever enough for them to do anything, but there was a lot of limestone. And you look at Jerusalem especially, and everything is made out of limestone, just because it was really easy to carve, and lots of it. So after coming off the mountain, we went to visit Yoav, and there's Yoav, and this is Willie Andrzejczyk, and he's now an Israeli, but he's from Oregon, but he's really good at prepping sites. And so the site is lined with these sandbags to kind of protect the edges, especially if you're digging a cross section that protects the surface, but it also kind of gives you an outline of where you're working. And this tumulus was being prepared for pictures, and Willie was saying, oh no, it's got to be so much cleaner, so he's running around with a little fine brush to get everything really, really clean before the pictures happened. And so we kind of stopped by and visited it with his team as we were coming back from the mountaintop. And so again, they're talking about how to take the pictures. There's certain times of day that you want to take the pictures so you get the best light contrast. You don't want to have it in a really, really bright light, but you want to have it so that you do get a good contrast. And I think it's like 2 o'clock. They were preparing to do it the next day because this was getting on towards sundown. Again, just looking at trying to determine how much of the loose stuff you want to take away and how much of the rock you want to keep. You have to kind of figure out what is the actual built structure there, and then you want to get rid of a lot of the stuff that is blown in. And in this area, there's a lot of this fine sand. They call it less. It's L-O-E-S-S, I believe. But it's sand that blows in and covers everything. You can actually see it on the hillsides between the boulders is this light-colored sand, and it blows in all the way from the Sahara on these extremely high winds during different times of the year. So this is the second site right in the area that they were going to investigate. It turns out that this was a leopard trap, and they're not really sure, they're having a hard time dating it, but this is one of the places where they were using that optically stimulated luminescence to dig down into it and get samples to see when it was actually built. And they weren't actually trying to they were most likely taking the leopards out so that they wouldn't either hunt the people or they wouldn't hunt their game, being gazelles typically was what the game in this area was, or ibex. Ibex are kind of like a desert goat, but both of those still exist. There's no leopards there to the present, but there still are gazelles and ibex in the area. But then also, this could have been early herdsmen that were afraid their goats and sheep were going to be predated upon by the leopards, and so they wanted to trap the leopards. And these had been found other places, so this was kind of a big new discovery this year, the first actual leopard traps. And it's also very interesting too, and this is more or less my opinion or interpretation, but since some of these are so many thousands of years old, you bring all these rocks together, for some people it may have been a leopard trap. 1,000 years later they may have said, oh, let's bury somebody here, let's turn it into a tumulus. So these structures, being that they took a lot of labor and resources to build, and because there was such a great, again, time scale of the chronology, they may have been used for different things. And so again, it's very important as you go through and clear all of this loose sand and that sort of thing, to be very careful. We found in one of the tumuli, and then also in our site, we found these tiny, tiny little beads, like somebody dropped a necklace and these little beads had gone out. A lot of them were made out of shell material, and of course, the Red Sea is fairly close, and so there was a lot of the decorative things were made out of seashells. And they could have also been used as currency and that sort of thing, as well as being decorative or religious, like an amulet. Again, you're just taking very precise surveys. As you go down, you take your levels, take your elevations, so you know exactly how much material you moved. This is the next day. We were sent out again into kind of the north part of the park that's not very visited, and we had, again, ERAS had sent us out with several kind of objectives. This is a very interesting structure, and they call it the Ottoman Fortress. It's a fairly recent. So the Ottomans, being the Turkish Empire that ruled until around World War I. I think they ruled probably from about the 1400s until World War I. They've been there for quite a while, but this is really interpreted as kind of an outpost. And so we worked our way over to the Ottoman fortress, and it may have been used up until probably like maybe the 1920s by herdsmen, Bedouin that would just use it, throw a tent over the top of it. Again, it's fairly recent. It's not really in the scope of the Central Timna Valley project, but it was something interesting. And again, somebody might say, well, I'm really interested in the Ottoman period. I'd really like to investigate this in the future. But pretty well preserved. It had several little smaller structures that may have been storage structures around it. So we looked at that. Just briefly, we spent maybe 20 minutes there, but one of our tasks for the day was to go and locate these manganese quarries. And so manganese, I started to be able to recognize this kind of a purplish red color in the rock, and the manganese is actually naturally occurring, but then the water, as it works its way down through the rock, makes these manganese nodules. So they look like little ball bearings. And so we located this, and this had been dug in enough that it actually collected some water. And so the manganese was actually used in the smelting process. That's what they call a flux. So you crush it up, you put your charcoal, your burning charcoal in, you put your copper ore in, all ground up. The flux of manganese would actually reduce the temperature. It was kind of a catalyst. It would reduce the temperature which the copper would melt. And so it's kind of like when you throw rock salt down on ice, it changes the melting temperature. And the other thing is that when you're smelting, it actually helps the copper be more fluid. So the actual smelting pots, the little furnaces, they kind of look like a terracotta pot, and they're only good for one use. And so at the end, you tap it, and it literally means you break it, and you let the copper, or you let the slag run off, and then the copper will stay at the bottom. And you want to get really good separation. Whenever we were looking at slag, if the slag had lots of pieces of copper in it. It's like they weren't doing a very good job. They weren't very good at smelting because a lot of the copper which they were trying to get at was remaining in the slag. So manganese helped separate the copper and make it kind of flow better and flow to the bottom, and then you tap the furnace and the slag would flow off, and you'd be left with this kind of sphere or half sphere of copper that again could be used as just a trade unit. It could be taken to wherever somebody was smelting. Because there was no tin in the area, the tin either had to come from Afghanistan or Anatolia in modern Turkey, so they had to take it somewhere to make it into bronze. So if they did something with it here, it was pure copper. It didn't have the the durability or the flexibility that bronze did after it was made into that alloy. So, but very interesting to go find this. So this was again one of those very interesting kind of innovations that sometime in history they suddenly said, well, what if we take these things and add to this? What's it going to do? And they found out that it made it a lot more effective and just efficient to get to the copper. It really separated things out. So the manganese nodules were really neat. We found a really neat one to take as a sample, so it would be cataloged. And it's very interesting that just around the corner, that back in probably the 1940s and 50s, there had been a modern manganese mine, and they got into an area where the nodules were just huge. And this is actually where they had been drilling in, and either drilling in with a drill and either mechanically separating it or actually using explosives to get to these really big manganese nodules. And then they actually went into the cliffside and followed one of these veins of manganese in. So again, it's still a very useful industrial metal, but it had a very specific use during the smelting days in Timna. So one of our new methodologies is the use of drones. So we got to go out, and this, especially again, when we're out in the areas that were just blank on the map and we were sent out in a single day, we might have a couple of square miles to survey, and by this point it was just 2 or 3 of us. The drone was very helpful because you could recognize especially these stone outlines, and so we could send it up and we could cover just a lot more ground. A lot of times we get up onto a kind of a high bluff or overlook or something and send it up. And so once we did that, once we had an idea, then we'd go and try to locate an area. And this was a really neat little kind of side draw. It was not some place that there was a major draw on the side that where we would have taken the picture from, that had at one time blown out, and so the water very rarely flowed down here. And so we found this whole site here, and we called it the protected smelting site because it was protected from the wind. It was also protected from the sight lines of people that may be going through this pass over here. There was a little watchtower right here, so somebody would have been up here watching. But as we went through this site, we first, well, it's definitely a site, but then we started locating things, and you can always tell when, there might be copper ore anywhere, just because of the area. And again, people were using it for different things. The processes that, water could carry it a long way from the cliffs where it may have been. But when we find slag, we know it's a smelting site. We know that somebody actually was doing smelting there. So this site was very interesting because we did find that. Gaia, like I said, is an expert at flint, and so she could definitely tell you that this was a flint core right here that had been napped, and it was very interesting because some of these flint cores, we were putting them back together like a puzzle, and you would say, okay, well, this is definitely mud, and you can also see kind of the concussion marks, so somebody actually was intentionally breaking it. It just didn't break naturally because of another rock fell on it. But then also you find places where, oh, well, a lot of this thing is missing. We try to put this back together and say, okay, they used a lot of these for points, for knives, for whatever. And so that was very, very good to have her on the survey because she could identify those very clearly. Again, once we were out, we tried to try to give what our interpretation of an area is, and this one was most likely where the smelter was, and so we put an arrow down, and this arrow it indicates north, and it also gives scale, so you know when you're looking at a picture later. And then of course we do a little signboard that says the date and what we think it is, and who we are and that sort of thing too. It's kind of a little information plaque. So the next day we went closer to the cliffs, and we'd seen these the day before, and we were wondering if they were just natural formations from wind erosion, or if they were actually mines. And this day we were disappointed because they were just natural erosion, little caves. Didn't really go anywhere. Couldn't find any sign of any kind of working. No chisel marks. No stone hammers or anything like that. So we're kind of disappointed that day, but
That's a cool thing.
it was very cool. Yeah, very cool to go see. So but we did. But again, it was kind of our job to go out and investigate a lot of these things, and then take very good coordinates so people could come back and investigate it, especially if somebody was particularly interested in a certain topic, really. Yeah, they could come out and potentially do a dig there. Again, just kind of investigating this. Some things we found with the drone. Again, you trying to cover a lot of area, and you just look, you might not be able to see something like this because it's just a native stone. But with the drone, it made it a lot easier. This is something that I was able to locate. So that was, I got to claim it. I called it mini Stonehenge. So it was kind of in this open area that was sandy, and so we were just kind of spitballing, saying, okay, what's our interpretation? Well, was it a tent, a Bedouin tent, and they just had stones to keep the edges down? And we're like, well, no, I don't think so, because it's not, a perfect circle. It's actually more like a walkway. And so my interpretation of mini Stonehenge, of course, was that it was either some kind of a solar clock or some kind of a religious site. Because it was a very interesting collection of stones. It was irregular, and that's something that we have seen, and I will show you later on, things that lined up with the solstice and things like that. So again, we spent 20 minutes there, but we made note of it, and we made a good description of it. Those are our packs, so that kind of gives you an idea of what it looks like. So again, it's very interesting. Definitely take more interpretation. An excavation would be great. See if there was any cultic items there, amulets, things like that might be put there. Something that we found a lot, and my interpretation is that they either might be an amulet or a votive offering to the gods, is shell fossils. And there's a lot of times you'll find shell fossils because of all these layers up here have lots and lots of shells in them, because they're from they're limestone from the bottom of the ocean. And so you wonder, my other interpretation is that the parents got tired of the kids, getting underfoot, and said, why don't you guys go find all the shells you can, and then go make a big pile of them and see how many shells you can find. So it might be as simple as that. It doesn't have to we always say, if people don't understand it, they say, well, it's cultic. So it's not necessarily cultic. But again, that would be something we need to do, to come back to this site and really look at it. I think I skipped a little bit ahead.
Ammonites?
Yeah, Ammonites. There, I don't think I've got a picture in this slideshow, but we found one that was actually embedded in a rock, and they're like a nautilus shell. But yeah, Ammonites, and again, that was another kingdom, and the modern name is Ammon, Jordan. The kingdom of Ammon was directly east of Israel. And again, oftentimes rivals, but one of Solomon's wives was actually an Ammonite princess. But yeah, very, very interesting. These connections. So this is this is something a shell found with the drone, and we determined that this was most likely fairly recent being 300 or 400 years old, but probably a Bedouin kind of a corral to keep their sheep in at night, to keep them safe. It didn't have a whole lot of fine work. It was just very utilitarian. But again, just things that the drone helped us to find. This is going back to, I believe that this was what they determined was a tumulus. Again, this is Yoav and his kids. I'm sure they're going to be preeminent archaeologists. They've grown up on digs, just super bright kids. I think they're like 7, 10, and 12. 2 girls and a boy, and just really, really good kids. Really, just a lot of fun to have on the dig, and very useful. But they loved it. It was kind of like their vacation. Since their dad does so much to administer the dig, they were able to get out of school and everything. So just a lot of fun. So the next area we went, these are what they call the plate mines. So the plate mines, this all is loose material. So again, it's like a plaster material. They would dig down into this loose material and just remove anything that had copper in it. And so again, these are really hard to date, at least with kind of conventional methods, because we didn't have any artifacts, what they call material culture. We didn't have tools or anything. They were just doing it by hand. So no tools or that sort of thing, but that's where the OSL, the optically stimulated luminescence, we can dig down into these in the dark, take samples and see when they last saw light. So what they would do is they dig down and they would take and they put the material in the mine that they've just been in, and that way they wouldn't go back and make a mistake and redig the same area. But again, so the early archaeologists called these plate mines because in the end they have these little round dimples that kind of look like plates. So this was our very most exciting discovery. So this was an actual shaft, excavated, chiseled shaft, and I was able to discover it by looking for chisel marks, and I'll show you a little later on some really good examples of chisel marks. And I kind of looked into it, and I said, they dug here. But then this Greek lady that was kind of helping, check my work, she went back and said, there's an opening back there, and you can see the sand. So this sand, and this is that sand that is blown in over the centuries from, probably all the way from the Sahara. And there was a gap of maybe an inch right there, and then the sand, this hard compacted sand, had just blown in there over centuries. But then once you start chipping at it, it would loosen up, and you could actually excavate it. So we found a very interesting tunnel, and there are granted hundreds, if not thousands, of these tunnels around. But the very interesting thing was that this one most likely hasn't seen anybody in it for 3,000 years. So very, very cool. We were able to go in and at least get a sense of the size of it. It made this sudden right angle, because I'd pretty much given up on it. It's like, oh yeah, they went into the copper vein. You can see very vaguely, you can see this kind of green right here. And I kind of given up on it. So I was like, I think that's all there is. And she went, like I said, checked my work and said, there's a lot more to it. So we were able to go in it, and it was very amazing because a lot of the chisel marks and the tool marks looked like they had been made yesterday. So it's like when you hit a rock with a hammer and it leaves like, that little compacted powder on it. Yeah, like a little impact. That was still like that. So because we were just on the survey, we didn't really do much else. We kind of explored enough to see what the extent of it was. It was very interesting because as you went down, there's the main shaft, but then some of these little side areas you can see where they just reach in and mine. And a lot of times as they went in, they would just be kind of pushing the ore back behind them. So a lot of these were very, very tight little shafts. And so I was very excited about that. So again, the survey, you're just trying to locate sites. So we as an expedition haven't really done a lot of actual excavation in the mine. So hopefully this will be something in the future that we can do. So there's a shell coming out of the hole. So again, it was very, very tight. So Anna, the Greek girl, and myself, we got to, since we were co-discoverers of this tunnel, we got to put our names on it. You can see a little of the chisel marks right here, but again, David's part of this was about this much of it, and Anna's was everything else, because she recognized the fact that, hey, there's more to it. It's not just all full of sand. So again, very, very, very cool thing. We want to go back. There's Anna right there. She's very pleased with herself. And at this point, I think we're going up onto this hill where we're going to fly the drone again and just kind of go and see if there was anything else that we may have missed. This is something that's really cool on the national park, and this is right actually at the park headquarters, right next to where we stay, and this is a scale model of the tabernacle. And the Bible's very specific about all the things that are in the tabernacle. So you had the actual altar out here, and they know that it had what were called the horns of the altar, so these little things on the side that are shaped like horns. And it was one of the things that if somebody had accused you of something and you're running away from them, if you were able to put your hands on the horns of the altar, that means that your case would be heard. They couldn't just summarily execute you. So if you were able to clasp onto the horns of the altar, you'd be given asylum, really, until your case could be heard. This is the bronze basin out here that's outside, and then of course inside is the stand of the showbread, which was just kind of a bread offering. The menorah was inside, and then of course in the back was there was a curtain in the middle, and then of course in the back is the Ark of the Covenant. So this was the traveling temple. So for all those years, the 40 plus years that the Israelites were wandering in this area, they had a movable temple, and so wherever they went, they break it down and take it with them. So it's really interesting for people to be able to go through this and get a sense, especially with the scale of it, because everything it's like 60 cubits long, and and the menorah weighed how many ever shekels, which was the measurement of weight. So a religious group in Germany made this probably in the 60s or something like that, but they were very, very precise on everything. So it's really cool to be able to go through that and see exactly scale-wise. It's a scale model of what it was like. This is an area where these are some of the copper ingots. These are reproductions, but this again gives you an idea of when the furnace was actually broken. These little kind of half spheres. The copper settled to the bottom. They'd break the furnace. The slag would run off the top, and this really was your trade unit. So this was they probably tried to keep it a uniform size. It's unfortunate we don't have hardly any. I don't think we have any examples of furnaces because they were all broken. They did their job once. It was one and done. You had one time to start your fire in there, add your flux. You would add air. Something that we do find, something called tuyères, and they're little ceramic rings that were actually put on the furnace, and that whatever the method of either a bellows or a blow tube that you were blowing air into the furnace, the tuyère was kind of the little bushing that allowed you to introduce pressurized air into the furnace. So again, whenever we found tuyères, we really knew that there had been smelting going on in that area. Again, slag is a really good indicator that it's really rare to find in the copper. The copper, it took so much resources and labor to get the copper that the refined copper, it was gone. We had never found a copper chisel. We knew the copper chisels were used extensively, but once they wore it down just to a nubbin, they just throw it back into the furnace and either make it into an ingot or an ingot that could be reworked into another full chisel. So we don't have any of those because it was just such a valuable commodity that it was either shipped away or just very carefully taken care of and then recycled. Again, this is what they call the mushroom site. This is one of the very first areas, and this is a very, very neat geological formation, but there's furnaces right here in this area. This is one of the very, very old furnace locations. Again, we can see the slag around these dark colored rocks. Wherever you see that green, you know that there was copper that was being worked. This is Erez right here, so that's the dig director. So The first Saturday, we went out and with Ayers and kind of did a big tour day to go all over the park and look at different things. This is one of the main canyons, and this, again, fills up with water, and when it does, there's tremendous amount of erosion. And this is actually the bottom or the side of a shaft. The opening of the shaft is way up here, and so, 4,000, 6,000 years ago, however long this was, the floor of the canyon was way up here. And so that kept blowing my mind that, you're thinking about how many thousands of years and how much the erosion has happened, that there was places a little further down where there had been mines that had gone in, gone down, and gone across, and then come back up, but now the sides were exposed because the canyon had eroded that much that had completely exposed these mines. So further down the canyon, this is something that was one of the former park managers found, and it was very interesting because we had a guy that was a Syrianologist, and then we had a guy that had worked at the British Museum, and they were going on debating, well, maybe it's Sumerian, and well, it's got elements of this and that, and maybe it's some sort of late Egyptian hieratic, and all these different possibilities. So this is the mystery inscription, and it's way up on the side of a cliff, and it would have been very difficult unless, of course, at that time the bottom of the ravine was here. So again, we have to think about all of those things that happened. So this was very interesting. A lot of pictures taken. Again, having a very interesting international crew. They could go back and debate it. This is a very this is one of these things where it's like your mom says, "There's a sign there for the reason," and our gig director's like, "Ignore the sign." So this is an area that was a placer area. So again, like this alluvial rock, and it had just settled in here in floods, but because it had loose copper in it, it had been excavated, and this area probably, and we know that because there's an inscription in here, and it's very interesting because the inscription is right here, and so our two Greek ladies were, of course this is, ancient Greek, but they're trying to read it, and pretty much what they decided was that this was probably a Roman soldier, but during that time, because so much of this area had been tied with the Decapolis after Alexander the Great conquered the area, that a lot of the people, a lot of the conquered peoples actually wrote in Greek, even though it was still during the Roman period. And they believe that this guy that signed his name and possibly his unit, his Roman legion and that sort of thing here, they think by his name that he was a Nabatean, so that was his ethnic group, which were the people that started Petra, which Petra not being too far away. So very interesting, and probably at this time this mine was probably at least 1,000 years old, minimum, when this Roman soldier wrote in Greek that he was actually an Nabatean on the wall. So, but very interesting, yeah. So going a little further down, this is where I was talking about this. There have been this U-shaped sort of mine shaft, and this had all been underground, and this had all been exposed. And it's very interesting because almost always in archaeology, you have the most recent stuff at the top, and then as you go down, it gets older. But because this mine was worked at different phases, the top part, which was what they worked at the beginning, you have all these tiny little dimples because they were using what they call hammerstones. And the hammerstone is basically just a rock sphere with little dimples for your fingers and thumb, and you would just hammer away at it. And so you have this up here that is probably early Bronze Age. They were still using stone tools to get to it. It might have even been chalcolithic. Like I said, they were using it for pigment because they didn't know how to make it into metal at this time. But then down below, they were actually using copper chisels. So yeah, again, very rare in archaeology to see the older stuff on top. But because of the mechanics of the way things were happening, that this was excavated first, and then they came back and said, oh, well, this shaft is still good. But again, too, it's very interesting that this was all, had all been exposed. This was all, deep underground when they were actually down mining. So this is, again, back out on the survey, getting ready to fly the drone. And it's very interesting because these the little plate mines were perfect little launch pads for our drone. And they were just like a little heliport for the drone to go up. Here's a really nice picture of a in situ copper vein. So again, probably when people were actually there looking, this was probably underground, and so they didn't find it. But it's just because it was so close to the surface, this may have been weathered within the last 100 years or 10 years, who knows? But this was what they would have been looking for. If they found something like this, they said, "Oh, this is a nice vein. We're going to excavate right in here and go as deep as we can, and as long as we're still getting good high-grade copper, they can just keep excavating." So I believe that this is the area where that tunnel I showed you before is right in this area. So it went into the rock and then made a very quick right turn right into the massive part of the rock. This is that sand, that blown-in sand that had blown into the area. This is, again, the tunnel. This is probably 4 or 5 days after we had discovered it. This is a little bit better picture. You can see especially early workings here, the stone tool marks, hammerstone marks over here on this side. And with my insistence, it's like, we need to go back and close that up. I don't want I don't want people going in there throwing their trash in it or anything like that, because it is really rare to find something that had been sealed up for that long. And just to preserve it, and hopefully we can go back and it was really dusty, it was really hard to breathe in there, but to go back with proper lights, proper respiration devices, things like that, and really get a good look at any stone tools, any material culture that they may have left in the mine, since we knew it was a nice pristine site.
I have a question about destruction.
Mm-hmm.
Did you ever run across graffiti or anything like that people had?
There was one spot over very close to the pillars, Solomon's pillars, in a very high traffic area. But it's the Israelis have a really great respect for the past, and a lot of times elementary classes from a very young age they go out on digs. Even they have what they call dig for a day, where they go out and dig. And of course so much of it is the whole Jewish culture and their heritage and that sort of thing too. So they're very respectful of it too. So we didn't usually see that. It was more likely just carelessness or garbage and that sort of thing, or people that just didn't know how to respect the site, or maybe not, just thought, oh, it's just a bunch of rocks, and they climb over it and knock them down or something like that. So, but that's a good point. But again, we just because this was a pristine shaft, wanted to seal it up, and so that it would remain a good place for possible future better excavation. This is really interesting because this is a little parasitic plant that lives on the acacia tree. So you see the acacia tree. This is one of those that the giraffe has that long tongue and it's able to get around all the thorns and get these tiny little leaves. But this is actually a parasitic plant with these big lobe-shaped leaves that grows on the acacia tree. And here is the acacia tree, and like I say, that's pretty much the only real tree there. If there's an oasis, there might be some palm trees. There's a few date palm plantations down in the floor of the valley, but as far as native trees goes, that's about it. And this was what they were most likely having to use for the smelting, that they were making this into charcoal, and and they had to use tons of it. So, and again, they were having to bring it from further and further away. So, and these are a lot, compared to what you see like in the Serengeti. These are the Serengeti ones are much bigger because they get a lot more moisture. But still the same species, but these adapted to a much drier area. So after the survey, Ashal got his own site, and this was a site called 185, still pretty close to the Hathor Temple and the pillars, but it was a series of several old buildings, and it was very nice because something that we appreciated about Slaves Hill and Benno Rothenberg, he would excavate just fractions. He'd do, a half of a structure or something like that to allow new technologies and new methodologies, the next generation to come in and be able to do the job that he couldn't. He knew that as a progressing field, that archaeology, he could only do so much, and we have a lot more really interesting and exciting tools that we can use. So we did maybe a quarter of this site actually excavated. This was Ashal's first site. So I got put in a square, and I got demoted from being his assistant. So this guy, he's the guy that used to work at the British Museum. He's a Sicilian, very, very knowledgeable about a lot of the technical aspects. And so he got promoted to being the assistant, and he did a lot of the recording. He did a lot of the technical aspects of taking elevations and that sort of thing. So just had a lot of that knowledge. We usually had about a half a dozen people on the site. We called it 185. That was its official designation. So this is really when we're getting started on 185. Again, this is most likely a half wall with a tent over the top. We had some structures that were circular over here. We didn't really get into those too much. We had an area that we ended up finding some tools right here, so that was probably either a workshop or storage area, and then kind of an open courtyard. Again, when you set up the site, you start with the sandbags. That's delineating your site. You put in rebar and string lines, so you know that that's going to be the extent of your site, and keeping everything else fairly pristine. So this is one of our visitors that came in and going, what in the world are you guys doing in that hole? I think you're idiots. There's no food in there. And so this is an ibex. This is a young male ibex. The adult male ibex have these beautiful curved horns, and you would see them coming around on the rocks. This was very interesting. We found a hammerstone. This is a guy that was a lawyer. He originally from Atlanta, but living in London. He joined the expedition about halfway through, just on a whim, and knew nothing about archaeology. I kind of took him on. I was kind of his sponsor to show him things, and he was very, very excited. He found a really neat hammerstone. So you can see the hammerstone. Again, it's just a sphere of hard rock with little dimples, so you can grasp it. And it was probably one of the most exciting finds we got early in this kind of workshop area right here. But then as we went through, Anna, the Greek girl, found this, where her interpretation is it's a fishhook. But we're like, we're still a ways from the ocean. So the other interpretation is it might be a garment hook for like buttoning your clothes. It could be a hook where you would hook together the tent covering. So again, a lot of different interpretations. She found it sifting the same area. I found a really neat a copper needle. And unfortunately, I didn't even they whisked that needle away from me so quick and put it in a special finds box before somebody lost it, which I never got a picture of it. But we have a sketch of some of the other things that were found by Rothenberg. So this was probably from the late 50s, early 60s, and he found very similar things. So again, up to interpretation, but this is almost exactly, it just looked like a very proper common needle like you find today. But very interesting, when it gets to the lab, it will have chemical analysis done to see if it was pure copper, which means that they made it on site, or if it was bronze. So bronze meaning that it was sent off to an industrial center. Again, the tin to make bronze had to come from Afghanistan or Turkey, and then it would have been brought back. So, but most of these were copper, were pure copper that were made on site for local consumption. So here's another picture of the hammerstone right here, and kind of this area where it was found. And again, our little plaque and our little meter stick and our arrow and everything, so we can kind of document it. This is just kind of the progression of 185. Something they had excavated a few years ago was what they called the Temple of the Rising Sun. And when I heard about this, and this other guy, this is the guy that he's a Syrianologist. He specializes in this area, and we heard about this at a lecture one night, and they said, oh yeah, and in the morning, we think that it's for the solstice, it comes right up at the beginning of it. They have what they call in Hebrew matzavot, which are standing stones, and so standing stones were very significant for whenever something happened. They would stand up the stones, so whenever somebody came by, they'd say, what do these stones mean? Originally, this temple had 2 of these stones on the sunlight side, and it was very unusual. At first they couldn't really figure it out because all the other structures are either square, rectangular, or round, and this one was this kind of trapezoidal. And then they started excavating, and this was within the last decade. I'm not sure exactly when they did, but they started realizing that it was oriented perfectly towards the sun at solstice, and so we were still pretty darn close, at the end of January, to seeing this happen. So Yoav took me and this Matthew Ong out here before the crack of dawn to see this. So Yoav is just a saint. And then afterwards, we both walked to our respective dig sites. So I got to walk by the Hathor Temple. So just kind of seeing it from afar, and just walking back. So the Hathor Temple is right there at the base of the rock, and just walking back up to 185. And then of course, if you were the coffee kit keeper, the coffee kit was essential on an archaeology dig. And there was, if you wanted to spark a lively debate, ask a Greek, an Israeli, and a Turk how to make coffee properly, and you would have a huge debate. So here we have Anna that's Greek and Ashal that's Israeli, making the coffee, and she's making sure that it's going to be good, and really strong coffee, really thick, good coffee. But definitely a very interesting part of the ritual. This is pretty close to the completion of 185. We had everything pretty well excavated out. Again, we left this entire half for future archaeologists to come back and do a better job of. A little trigger happy here. So this is very close to where we parked petroglyphs. This was, again, this is about all the graffiti that we saw. So this obviously is recent, but here's a nice picture of the ibex. And we had, hunter figures. We kept seeing this symbol, which was either 3 or 4 of these pillars, and we're like, well, maybe it's the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. Maybe it's the guy that was Italian it's the wolf that raised Romulus and Remus, and they're suckling from her, and it's like, I don't think so. But anyway, so there was some debate as to what the petroglyphs meant, other than this one, which we're like, that is an ibex, and this is probably these 3 guys are probably herding or hunting the ibex. And of course, the ibex are standing right there, so we're like, well,
Those
another
pillars.
context. Yeah, it's really interesting. So that's.
Those 3 pillars.
Oh yeah. Oh, okay, there we go.
Maybe.
Sometimes you overthink it. Yeah, Solomon's pillars.
Were they there then?
Yes. Yes, they've been there a long time. Yeah, good interpretation. Thanks, Terry. I never thought of that. I was overthinking it. So this is one of the other sites where they were excavating a really deep slag mound, and I didn't really work on this one. This was one that had to have there was a lot of labor to get this hole down to see exactly how much slag was here. This was at the base of Slaves Hill. Don't really know too much about it. This was one. This is Mark Kavanaugh. He was my former supervisor 3 years ago, and this was kind of his site. And they found this structure, and it just kept going deeper and deeper, and it had probably been domed. And so towards the end, Aras, the dig director, kind of took us all there. And here's Willie, and he's probably six foot tall. And so he's way down, and he's wearing his DNA suit. It's this suit so he doesn't contaminate DNA samples. And so he's down in it looking, and we're looking at this really hard. It's almost like a clay material. And so there was debate. Was this a cistern? You know, was it a storage silo? Pretty much everybody, I don't know, the consensus was that it was a kiln to make charcoal. And you know, all the way to the present, the way you make charcoal is you start a fire and then you cover it with mud. But because water was such an issue here that you had to bring water from elsewhere, from one of the oasis towns, it would make a lot of sense to have an oven that you would use again and again to make that charcoal for the actual smelting process. So again, a lot of samples were taken. Again, it was a very interesting exercise towards the end. That everybody had their own ideas. Something that I developed as an idea that right when the dig is done, you're going to find something really interesting, and it proved out many times. And so this is at 185. This is about the time we were starting to backfill into our pits to protect it in case we wanted to come back. I found this very interesting. This is the same place that we found the fish hook and the needle and the hammerstone. I found this stone that was probably a grinding stone. Everything else is this really rough surface, and this was just super smooth on one side. And I literally found it like this is like the evening of the last day we were digging. So again, towards the end, you had the thing you needed to do was to backfill, because a lot of these were going to come back. So at the end, we got to go to the beach, have beer, have fish and chips, go wade in the Red Sea. There's our lawyer from London, very pleased with himself after his first. Like I said, he did it on a complete whim. He just, a week into it, he said, "Hey, can I come on?" And he's like, Yoav was like, "Sure, jump on a plane." So he had a good time, and that's looking out at the Red Sea. Here's the Edomite Mountains over here. Edomite. The reason it's called the Red Sea is because of the mountains. It's not because of the sea. The sea is beautiful blue, but the Edomite Mountains, very red color. Also very jagged, very intense mountains. So, like I mentioned, after the dig was over, I got to go to Petra for a day, and so that was just really amazing. After looking for tiny little things and little piles of rock, to go to Petra, where you had all of this, just amazing architecture that was just carved out of the rock. So this is a tomb that is cut out of a single stone. Some more, probably nobility was buried in these tombs, very ornately carved. This is some of the bigger multi-purpose type buildings. It was really a trade city, but because the Nabateans were so well situated to take advantage of the trade in spices, especially the frankincense and myrrh and things that were coming from Arabia, they were kind of middlemen, and they were able to really make this city that was just a showplace, and to carve into this super deep sandstone. I mean, there's stairs. This was a cistern right here that collected water in all these various little kind of gutters, I guess is the best way. Here's a good example of the way this gutter went all the way down this canyon. So all the water would collect into the gutter, and then it would go into these little dams wherever it got to a side canyon. Again, it was really really a really big city, and so they had to have a lot of water. The village there at the present is called Wadi Musa, and that means Moses' ravine. And there's springs. There's some smaller springs above the dam. Is the place where they speculate that was where Moses struck the rock and got the water. So that's how Wadi Musa got its name. But then, much later, Petra was carved out of the stone, and they had, because it was a much bigger city, and it lasted for quite a while. They had to have a good water collection. So obviously, this is much of this was through the 4th century AD, and so obviously they had Greek writing, they had they kind of adopted a lot of different cultures that were in the area. So they had Egyptian motifs in their architecture. They also had Greek motifs. Of course, they had a lot of the influence of the Arabs. This is the most famous building. This is the treasury, and you go down what they call the souk, which is this really twisting little slot canyon to get down to it. And so when you come out, boom, there it is.
Wow.
And it was just amazing. They thought that this was the bank at the time, and unfortunately there was this legend that these pillars and these statues were full of gold. And so the Bedouin had shot at this. They were hoping it would be like a slot machine, and gold would just start cleaning out. But it's really interesting too, because the original kind of rock cut ladders that they used to build this are still there. But again, it's really interesting because it's kind of an amalgam of a lot of different cultures. Again, and it goes down this canyon. It was actually the day of the big earthquake, and we didn't feel it there, but on that day, very ironically, the civil authorities were doing a evacuation exercise there, but they were doing it for a flash flood. But it was interesting because they actually filled the old reservoirs with water, and then were pumping the water down the ravine to simulate a flash flood, and they evacuated people during that. Again, it was just what really struck me was just how, this was all just part of the living rock. This was, these pillars were not made somewhere else and brought here. They were just carved right out of the rock. And what also really impressed me too was the color of the rock. I mean, I've been, some interesting places in Utah and Arizona and seen some really neat rock, but it just doesn't hold a candle to the wild colors that you see in the rock in Petra. And I also was really impressed by some of the interiors. And again, you see that really wild colored rock where it's hasn't really been dressed. But this is probably a 50 by 60 foot interior of one of these rock cut buildings. Afterwards, I went to the Oasis town, went to a site that was a early Islamic site. So by this time, they really knew what they were doing with copper and smelting it. And so, whereas the early Bronze Age, we're looking at slag pieces like this, and then when we're talking about like the kingdom of David and Solomon, you're talking about slag pieces like this. By the time the Arabs were doing it, they were getting much bigger slag. They really were starting to understand what they were doing. And this is actually a very interesting site because not only did it have the very big slag, this one shows the copper in it, so maybe they were a little too confident. They probably could have even done a little bit better and gotten more of the copper out. But again, it just shows the color. Again, here's just a pile of the slag. Then the town of Beora goes way back because it was one of the, like I said, the two oasis town. And the word Be means a well, and Ora means light. But before the present town was founded here only 20 years ago, it was a military base. It was called, the Gadna, which was kind of like our ROTC. It was like training up kids to go into the army. So I did a little bit of my own, this is only 70 or 80 years old, archaeology, but I did a little bit of my own archaeology. But the town is absolutely beautiful. So kind of winding down, and also this is where I left to go to Petra. Just a very beautiful little settlement around this ancient well in the southern part of the valley. So there's looking at the town from up by where their water tank is. This is the Eilat airport is right here. So it's pretty close to the airport, but a very compact town. This is their synagogue right here. This is the kind of the school and the city buildings, and then this is pretty much just all residences over in this area. This is looking back at Timna, so looking back at Mount Timna right there from where the well was. So again, one of the big mysteries is how they got the water all that way. This is a place that I found that was a natural deposit full of these shells. So these are fossilized shells that were just coming out of actually a road cut. but I just thought that was, interesting to find them just falling out of the wall. An excavation very close, like right over here is probably where the ancient well was, and so this was an excavation that was done probably 40 years ago. I'm betting one of Rothenberg's. Again, they have a lot of respect for it, so they will let you know, that this is an archaeological site, and to take care of it, because we might want to come back and see what else we can learn. And that's pretty much it.
Woo!
Very nice.
So, questions? Yeah, Ed.
I'm kind of interested in, the science of archaeology, and I guess, I don't know if I can say this well, but my question basically is, obviously this starts somewhere, these digs.
Sure.
Somebody discovers an interesting thing. But is the science, well, let's see what we can find, or is it, you had all these different specialists with you and
Yeah.
investigators in different areas.
Yeah.
And do they come with a specific question? I want to determine this.
Yes,
Or is it
yes.
just-
That's what we call the primary objective. And a lot of times the primary objective is set by the dig director. So Aris, he's very interested in this archaeometallurgy, and the paleomagnetism. And that was kind of what he started investigating the slag for dating, and also correlating with the carbon-14 and that sort of thing. But then people said, oh yeah, we found a whole bunch of plant remains, and we found skeletons, and we found this and that. So that's where the specialization occurs. Something I can kind of speak to as far as the mechanics of it. Once you start the dig, there's what they call loci, which is you keep digging until the character of what you're digging changes. So like the color or the texture, and then you label it. You take an elevation typically, so you know that something has changed. So you take off the overburden, and then you'll be in a certain occupation layer of whatever they were doing at that time. Maybe it was sheep herders that were living there in the 1880s or something, and then you go back and maybe it was the Ottomans had it as an outpost, and you find their things. And as you go down, each time the character changes, you label that and make note of that.
Thank you.
And then, of course, as the artifacts come out, you label them, you tag them, and you put them in a special, they call it a basket number. So it's like all the artifacts from a certain loci go into a certain basket. And then once they get back to the university, they get properly researched and tested.
Is that a bird or just a branch?
I think it's just a branch, but there's some really interesting nests there.
That is very cool.
But yeah, that was my last evening in Israel. I was wandering around and taking
Well,
pictures.
that looks interesting.
But that was really near to the ancient Beora well.
One other thing, David, what was the pathway that led you here? How did you?
Well, I was always interested in archaeology, but my family has been involved in mining in Colorado for generations, and my great grandfather worked in one of the silver mines up by West Cliff and Silver Valley, and my dad was a tour guide in the Molly Kathleen mine up outside of Cripple Creek back in the early 70s, and so always interested in mining. And then, like I say, this is one of the very few digs that happens in the winter, so it's a good timing for me.
How did you find out about this?
Actually, there's a journal called Biblical Archaeology Review, and every year they come up, they have an article that has all the contact information. They also have really good websites, and they kind of act as matchmaker for international volunteers and the dig directors. Yeah, so that's how I got into it.
Very nice, David.
What are the specimens that you have up there in front of
So-
the podium?
I have, right here, I have a flint, and the flint was, it's a chip, and you can see very much how it was impacted by a tool to bring it off the core. Then we have copper ore, which is, what obviously they were, so that's the flint. And you have the copper ore, so it's that very distinct green. Then slag, like I said, the slag was something that you would always recognize. That would be the thing that would tell you that actually smelting was there. There's a fossil shell, like I say, that is something, you know,